Welcome to the Think Christian podcast, maybe the only place that's trying to tie a theological thread from Taylor Swift's Midnights to Star Wars Andor. Josh Larsen here, your host. I'm not the problem, but not the solution either. So I don't know, maybe that makes me the antihero. We are talking about antiheroes on this episode of the TC podcast. Taylor Swift gifted us with the idea when she named the first single off her new album, Midnights, Antihero. It also happens that an antihero is the title character of the latest Star Wars series that's streaming on Disney+, Andor. That would be Cassian Andor, played by Diego Luna, who we last saw in the Star Wars feature film Rogue One. Kathryn Freeman and Forasteros are going to join me to consider what we can learn about the human condition from antiheroes, including those that we find in the Bible. A quick note before we jump in, TC's partner program Groundwork has a new free ebook just in time for Advent. It's called Christmas Hope and the Women in Jesus' Family Tree. This focuses on the women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. The idea is to explore the hope and the promise of Christmas for the broken, the traumatized, the outsider, and the imperfect. So if you would like to read that this Advent, you can get your free copy by going to groundworkonline.com/ChristmasHope. That's groundworkonline.com/ChristmasHope. I don't think you can describe any of the women in that genealogy as antiheroes, but some other biblical figures are going to come up as we get into this show. First up, another foray to a galaxy far, far away with Andor. Josh Larsen here, back with J.R. Forasteros. J.R., I knew you'd be a good fit for this topic, not only because you were probably already watching Andor, but you're the author of the book, Empathy for the Devil, Finding Ourselves in the Villains of the Bible. Now, villains and antiheroes, two very different things. Maybe you can give me your distinction between the two. Perhaps, as you were thinking about those sorts of terms when you were putting your book together.
Yeah, I look at a villain as someone who is just objectively doing something bad. So I would look at in recent pop culture, like a Walter White, right? Dude is cooking meth and he tells himself it's to provide for his family. But from the get-go, viewers know that that's not the case, right? That this is purely a pride thing for him. And so it's like he's a villain.
So even though he might claim conflict, there's no conflict on the viewer's part, is maybe.
Yeah, and I think the show was very intentional about framing it that way.
Okay.
Vince Gilligan said in multiple interviews that he was shocked that people still rooted for Walter, and in the writer's room, it almost became kind of a game of like, what's the thing we can do that will make people turn against Walter White?
Really?
And the answer was nothing. It didn't matter what he did.
Fascinating.
On the other hand, I would take someone like Magneto, who even when he was leading an organization called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which would seem to put you squarely in villain territory, had these very clear motivations that were not exactly wrong. I mean, the classic Magneto origin story is that he was a survivor of the Holocaust who had seen what happened when humanity decided someone was other, and he wasn't going to let it happen to him and his family again. And so when they started doing it to mutants, he said, okay, if you're so committed to might makes right, we're going to be the mightiest. And it's interesting, right? Because with the villain, it's more like we can disagree, like we can maybe even agree with their methods, but disagree with their end goal. Like I think there is a narrative. There was a TV show called Good Girls where some suburban moms start doing illegal things a la Breaking Bad, but it's because they don't have any other way to provide for their families legitimately. And it was much more of a critique of the limitations that women still face in our modern culture. And it was interesting because they were doing a lot of the same stuff as Walter White in big ways, but they felt more like antiheroes because you really did feel like this was the best option that they had. And I think with an antihero like Magneto, it's different, right? Because it's like we could condemn the methods as squarely villainous in a lot of cases and yet agree with his somewhat cynical take, but a take that often plays out as real, like that he was right. Like oftentimes in the comics and in real life, we see violence break out against the other simply because they're other.
Yeah, that example makes me think of Eric Killmonger in Black Panther, played by Michael B. Jordan.
Absolutely.
So there are
Absolutely.
villains that also serve that anti-hero role, I guess. All right, well, those distinctions are helpful as we move in and consider how they might apply to Andor, which is now streaming on Disney Plus. The title refers to Cassian Andor, played by Diego Luna. Now, in the 2016 film Rogue One, at that point, Cassian is a rebel intelligence officer, so he's already officially working against the evil empire. Andor takes place years before those events. So here, Cassian is still something of a scoundrel. He's trying to stay under the radar of the empire. When we meet him, he's in debt to friends. He's scrounging together money by stealing parts to sell in the black market. He's basically mostly a guy living for himself.
People blame you for what happened.
Blame me?
You killed 2 corpos and came home to hide. Put the entire town at risk and now there's Imperials on the street.
If Tim had kept his mouth shut.
If this, if that, if you, if me, if Tim.
We were doing a deal you
You
set up.
scam, you borrow, you lie, you disappear.
As the series proceeds, and as of this recording, there are still a couple of episodes left to air, Cassian gets increasingly caught between the Empire and the rising rebellion. And so, to my mind, he's moving ever so slowly from a pretty clear anti-hero to something maybe more heroic, if still conflicted. Now, J.R. Andor has been praised by critics for its maturity and complexity, I think especially compared to some of the other Star Wars series we've had. How about you? Are you as high on it as the general critical consensus has been?
I would say in terms of storytelling, absolutely. I love that we are witnessing the birth of the rebellion. I love that we are getting bureaucracy as evil. I think some of the characters who are committed to dotting the I's and crossing the T's are the ones who are actually successfully rooting out the origins of the rebellion, that otherwise would go unnoticed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really interesting. And I do enjoy how Cassian Andor seems to be getting dragged into the rebellion, kicking and screaming. Everything he does to try to get away from it ends up wrapping him up further inside of it, which in a way I think is an interesting commentary on the way empires fall, which we may want to get into later. But, there seems to be a theme that has been developed over the middle episodes that is the empire likes to assert control and dominance by slowly strangling us to the point that we don't. It's kind of the old adage of boil a frog in a pan, right? If you do it slowly. And the rebellion's way to resist that is to bring the violence front and center. So to do things that provoke this larger explosive violence that then makes the everyday citizens have to react in some way, have to respond rather than just sort of like slowly acquiescing to the gradual loss of rights and life. So I think all that's really interesting. I do think that at least in the first 6 episodes, it could have been the first 4 episodes. It's a little slow and could have had a pretty heavy hand in the editing. But I mean, it's Star Wars on TV, so it's hard for me to complain about that and not get beat up by my 12-year-old self. So
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. These episodes are taking their time, and there are even, maybe we'll get to this if we have times, certain plot threads and even characters that to this point feel completely extraneous. I mean, they fit narratively, but really the show would not lose anything without them. But at the same time, what I'm loving about it is that attention to detail, which you need the time for. This series so far has almost been like reading the minutes of a session of the Galactic Senate. And I mean that as a compliment.
That's a compliment.
Though. It is absolutely a compliment. It's very detail oriented. It's examining, as you said, the actual machinations of oppression, the tactics, the strategies, the meetings, the inter-office dynamics among, the people who are working for the empire. That all sounds really dull, but it is so smartly told, I've found, that it's all been fascinating to me. I'm sitting watching these long meeting scenes thinking, why am I not bored? First of all, I'm thinking, how in the world did this ever get greenlit? That they were going to give this amount of time with no blasters, no lightsabers, just to these meetings. And then the second question is, but I'm fascinated by this. And I think you can look to the showrunner, the creator here, and see maybe why. It's Tony Gilroy, who also made the great law drama Michael Clayton with George Clooney, a feature film that was very wonky, but it was riveting as well, following that case. And it was also attentive to the human cost of bureaucratic oppression. So I think there's a through line there, and explains to me why I'm eager for another meeting. Even though that goes against all of my instincts, I'm eager to see what happens at the next meeting of those galactic command or empire commanders, which you wouldn't think would be the case. Now, Michael Clayton is also the story of an antihero, and so it's very similar to what we get here with Cassian Andor. What do you think, JR, of this character, maybe compared to the one we see in Rogue One? And then I threw kind of a little experiment at you. Does Cassian remind you in any way of any of the antiheroes of the Bible? So maybe start with what you just think of him in general and his Rogue One appearance, and then we could get to those kind of biblical figures.
I'll do a teaser, Josh. My biblical answer is going to get me run out of the internet. So,
wow. Run out of the internet.
Inflame Christian Twitter. Those of us who are still there. You know, the moral universe of Star Wars has always been interesting. And I think people forget that George Lucas designed the original 3 movies to be kids' movies, you know? So very clear black and white, good and evil, you know, rebellion and empire. And the one notable exception to that was Han Solo, who was the scoundrel until, Josh, I'm sure you remember where you were when Greedo shot first, right? And
Yes.
how devastating that was for so many people, because that was Han's arc, right? He was an anti-hero. He was the guy who left, and it was a surprise when he showed up at the end of episode 4 and saved Luke and helped us end the day, right? And by having Greedo shoot first, they took that anti-hero-ness or villainy away from him, because now it's just self-defense. And that fit, I think, a lot more cleanly into Lucas's very simple binary of the day. But as we've all grown up, and as I think we've all hungered for that the moral gray that Han shot first implied might be out there in the Star Wars universe, right? And so now we're getting to realize all of that, right? With The Mandalorian and with Boba Fett, and now with Cassian in Rogue One, at the beginning of the movie, he kills a guy because it was in the interest of the rebellion. So it was still, this is what's good for the rebellion, but it was also he straight up murdered a guy, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, Luke would have never done that. Han probably would not have done that after George Lucas, whatever. And so it is interesting to take that back, because several of the characters in this show are needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kinds of logic, right? Luthen has been that way. It'll be interesting to see where Mon Mothma goes from this point. But some of the big leaders are the people who are, acting like generals in an army and sacrificing pawns and that kind of stuff.
The leaders of the rebellion, these are.
The leaders of the good guys, right? Are the ones doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And then you have Cassian, who comes in the middle of this, and he seems like a hustler, right? He's a wheeler and a dealer. He's always got 7 things going on. And he only gets dragged into this because of self-preservation. You know, these 2, they're not even actual Imperial guards, right? They're contractors who are at the far edge of the Empire, mess with him, and then he sort of accidentally kills one of them. And then so he has to kill the other one, and that's what sets this whole chain of events off. Is that
and there's a distinction even in that opening scene too, though. The second one is much more of a cold-blooded decision.
Right.
There's less gray area in his decision to kill the second man.
Yeah. And then everything else he does is out of this kind of, you get little flashes of it, right? I think when he kills the assistant cook from the Bear. I don't remember what his name is in the show, but The Bear's another great show if you haven't seen it. At the end of the heist, right? He recognizes this guy is going to take all the money from the rebellion, and so he has this moment of more altruism than we've seen from him, but it doesn't last.
That's a fascinating moment, because it's at once a stage, I think a significant stage in his decision of where he's going to land, because he's offered the chance to get in on this heist after
Split
the heist.
It was like 40
Basically,
million.
the two of them. Yeah. It's a chance for him to really live into what he's been saying he's there for all along, which is the money. And so he makes a choice there that, no, I am not going to at least take it that far. I'm going to draw a line in the sand in what I'm willing to do. But then we see that as maybe a noble gesture. At the same time, he makes the decision to go ahead and shoot the guy who proposed this. So it's a very muddy sequence that is representative of a lot of the things that we're watching him as a character and us as viewers deal with in this series. So let me get to your biblical figure. The internet's had a good run. I don't. I guess you're going to end it with this.
It's been nice, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I think it's King David.
Okay.
I am in the small company of people that actually don't think David was a great dude. And while he may have been an effective monarch, I don't think he was a hero by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, at any point in his life, arguably the most heroic thing he ever did was protect the sheep when he was a kid. But, after he's anointed by Samuel, right, he actually goes into this life of being a mercenary where he is robbing people, where he is actually fighting with the Philistines against his own people, the Israelites, a lot of times. And then, then he ultimately ends up taking the throne from Saul. And of course, the Bible provides a number of justifications for why this happens and that this is good and that this is God's plan. But a lot of that, one of the things we have to remember is that even the books of Samuel were written after David's death. So we're even that perspective as someone looking back on Saul's kingship and then David's assumption of that and doing so. Then, of course, in David's kingship, you have, the whole thing with, the rape of Bathsheba and the murder of his buddy Uriah, like a dude that was with him from way back before he was king. And then you have everything that happens with his children where, one of his sons rapes one of his daughters and then constantly trying to kill each other. One of his sons usurps the throne from him and drives him away. There's just this huge mess of a life. That just to me indicates someone who was not a very good guy. And I look at all of that and you can kind of see this. You can kind of see this man who way too often lives into his worst self, which is I think what we're seeing in Cassian in the first season here. This person who is always on the lookout for himself and is happy to help so long as there's something in it for him, but oftentimes will just present whatever face people need to see for him to get his way.
I think you make a strong case. This all makes sense to me when you think about so many of the stories of King David. And also, when you think of some of the Psalms, aren't they almost confessions of an antihero? They can be read that way. And so we get it from his own mouth, wrestling with his sin in some instances. And so, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. The person who came to mind as I was thinking about Cassian specifically, and it took me a while to get here, but it was Gideon. And John J. Thompson, who does our playlist for the show, for our episodes, we were emailing back and forth about this idea, and he mentioned Gideon along with a bunch of others. And at first I was like, that doesn't sound right, to me, just at a first impression. But then, was giving this some more thought, rereading some of these stories, and I realized, okay, John's onto something here. You have Gideon living under oppression, right, as Cassian Andor is, resisting the call to join the cause, even when the call comes from the angel of the Lord. He's still not on board. And then how about his complaining about the oppression we see? That really reminded me of another conversation in Andor where Cassian has been hired by the rebels to infiltrate an imperial garrison. So it's earlier than the conversation we were just talking about. And he only talks about being against something, not for something.
The pace of oppression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the Imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident, but they have a fight on their hands, don't they? Our elemental rights are such a simple thing to hold, they will have to shake the galaxy awfully hard to loosen our grip.
I'd like to hear what Clem believes.
I know what I'm against. Everything else will have to wait.
Now, of course, Gideon comes around in the biblical story. That's, I think, why immediately it made gave me pause when John mentioned it. And we do know from Rogue One that Cassian mostly comes around, at least compared to where he is here. So that made sense to me. I think what we're getting, we'll see where the series ends up, but something that could maybe be called the slow sanctification of Cassian Andor.
Yeah.
And this is hinted for me in the opening title that is very brief, but very distinctive. We see this looking in outer space, as we often are in Star Wars, and we see this crescent revealing itself as a planet as the light changes. And then that transforms into this symbol of, it's a symbol of the rebellion, right? I'm not sure if I'm got that perfectly right. My nerdiness only goes so far when it comes to Star Wars, but that's my impression. And I see that too as being this like dawning of a consciousness that we're seeing in the case of Cassian.
Yeah, it's like this slow work, which I think the word sanctification there is really perfect for that, right? The writer of Colossians says to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And I think we see that a lot in Cassian. He is increasingly unable to escape or to hide from the consequences of empire.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's spent his whole life kind of just able to, since he was a kid, right? And since his planet was destroyed by the Empire, he spent his whole life kind of hiding and just like kind of tunnel vision. I'm just going to worry about me and mine. Yeah. And I think he's getting to a place where everywhere he tries to turn and focus, there's still more oppression and still more oppression and still more oppression. And it's forcing a confrontation in him. You know, I was not able to save my sister. Does that mean I have no ability to save anyone else?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think I belong to a denomination that likes to imagine that sanctification is a quick sort of a thing. And I just don't think it is. You know, I think it is this slow, steady process of working out our salvation, you know, and refusing to hide from the consequences of sin in the world, you know, whether they're individual or systemic. And what happens in our spirits when we choose to bear witness and choose to ask, like Gideon, how might God be calling me to do something that is terrifying and seems impossible? And it said all the things that Gideon was afraid of, right? He's just such a sad sack, pathetic, last person you'd want to be
on the front lines. Not on the front lines of this.
Right?
Yeah.
Not the person that, you line people. I mean, much like the David story, right? He lines up all the brothers and it's not like the oldest, real handsome guy, and it's not even the second. It's the kid that is so unimportant he's not even there. Right? I mean, it's that kind of a thing. And yet again and again and again in scripture, that's who God chooses to work through, right? Is the outcast, the abandoned, the powerless. And so what happens when we stop treating that as a bug and start treating that as a feature? You know, what might God be able to do in us and in our world? I think it's a really potent question.
So a lot to dig into with Andor. I'm really glad that I made the time to watch it. We've talked about so much. We probably don't have time. We probably should cut out what we think they should have cut out and not get into those things. I'll just say I'm still waiting for Cyril Karn, that wannabe Empire lackey played by Kyle Soller. That better have some payoff because those scenes have not been riveting to me compared to the others.
Interesting.
So,
See, he was the first character that really grabbed me in this show.
Well, he was at first, and then it seems like he's sort of been put on a shelf, but we still have to spend a lot of unimportant time with him. I agree at the beginning. Yeah, I agree at the beginning.
I would be surprised if they don't bring him back around.
They're going to have to at this point.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
But thank you, JR, for talking about at least the first half of the season or so with me. Again, I'd encourage folks to check out JR's book, Empathy for the Devil. What else have you been up to lately? What's happening on the Fascinating podcast these days?
We just did a big spooky Halloween episode because we finished that up, you know,
Excellent.
And we've been talking about the impending water crisis and all that kind of stuff. I almost landed a Halloween Ends article at Think Christian, but it spiraled out of control, as sometimes my stuff tends to do.
Your words, not mine, by the way.
Yeah, no, 100% my words. Yeah, I got a little ways into that thing, and I was like, oh no, Josh, this is going off the rails. I'm sorry, but it ended up over at Tor.com. I was staggered when I got to the end of the last Halloween movie, and I'm doing air quotes because we all know it'll get another reboot or something. But they turned Michael Myers into a Christ figure. And if there was a cardinal rule of slashers, I would have thought the stabby guy doesn't get to be Jesus. So of course I had to write about that, and I had a lot of fun with it, even though it ended up being 3,000 words. So
yeah, it sounded like a fascinating idea. So I'm glad that came to fruition. That's at Tor.com.
That's at Tor. Right? Where, even though they're a secular publishing website, they love it when I get all Jesus-y. So
yeah. I think George writes for them from time to time too, doesn't he?
He does also,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, it's good to see you
got
guys.
Got our secret little Tor TC club. Don't tell
there
everyone,
you go.
But yeah.
And then
I have a Quantum Leap article coming up for
that
Think
is
Christian
right.
as soon as that show ends. So
your Quantum Leap dreams will come true on TC pretty soon. So
just love
looking
that
forward to that. All right, thanks again, Jer. We'll talk to you again soon, okay?
Thank you, Josh. Always a pleasure.
If you were checking this out on any platform other than YouTube, you would have just heard a little bit of Guster's Jonah, one of my favorite biblical antiheroes, and a great musical reflection, if you ask me. Hello, your deeply flawed musical protagonist, John J. Thompson here, and I've pulled together another carefully curated playlist full of pop, soul, country, rock, hip-hop, and alternative songs that grapple with the idea of the antihero from a variety of perspectives. I don't know, maybe it's because modern rock and soul music has such an outsider and subversive root, or maybe it's an after effect of these postmodern days, but antiheroes, or sometimes outright villains, have become common fodder for songwriters for a long time. I suppose that line, the one between the villain and the antihero, really comes down to perspective. Who is the protagonist of the story? Who's the central character we're supposed to be watching? I've long thought that the entire book of Judges can really be seen as a sort of litany of biblical antiheroes, with maybe the nation of Israel herself playing the ultimate role right in the middle of the whole story. So, in this mix, you'll find tunes about Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, and even Ehud, as well as some extra biblical examples of antiheroes as well. You can find the mix by searching Spotify for the Think Christian profile and following it. You can also find the link in the email you get from us if you are on the list. And don't forget the massive archive list as well. Until next time, this is JJT encouraging you to turn up the tunes and learn from the antiheroes, but try not to become them. Peace.
Kathryn Freeman is here with us. She's our specialist when it comes to the biggest women pop stars out there. After talking Beyonce's Renaissance this summer, she's now here to discuss Midnights from Taylor Swift. Kathryn, not a bad year when you get new albums from those two, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, this has been a great year for me as someone who admires both women. And we're going to probably get more Beyonce, and Taylor still has more albums to re-record. I'm very happy.
Yeah, they're both kind of still managed to stay on the radar after releasing that music, aren't they? With either things we have yet to know what they are or Taylor's tour coming up next year. So we'll probably be talking about them for quite a while. But right now we do have Midnights, both the standard album and then the 3 a.m. edition, the extra songs that she put out later. I don't know if we'll get to all of those, but I did want to find out from you, Kathryn, before we talk about some of the themes, some of the ideas at play in Midnights. What did you make of the album sound? Because it's not really a continuation of that quiet interiority, the sort of the forested feel that we got on Folklore and Evermore, is it?
No. I am probably in the minority, is that I actually prefer this, sonically, the music. Jack Antonoff, I think because they're such good friends, I just think that it's is personally my favorite Taylor collaborator. Let me just state, I love Folklore and Evermore has great songs, but just sonically, to me, this feels a little bit more innovative than I feel with Evermore and Folklore, she's leaning kind of more into the Joni Mitchell kind of thing, which maybe is where her career ends up as she, ages and goes into a next decade. But I just feel for me, maybe this is a minority opinion, but I really like Jack Antonoff and I love how his albums sound. And so, yeah, I'm happy with it sonically for the most part.
Okay. Yeah, he's producing the whole album this time. And I gotta say, I do love the touches that, you see from his other work. I think a lot of the synthesizers, which work so well with her voice, that is one of the highlights for me, those instances on the album. I didn't mind that she moved away from that folkloric period. I think that's probably still my favorite stuff of hers. But I will say I probably appreciate the songs here that maintain some of that without going too far back towards something like Reputation. This is very much has a sense of everything she's done before coming together. And it's a bit of a move back sonically to something maybe even more like Lover would be more accurate. So yeah, I had fun with it, though I'm probably not so much like you where the Folklore and Evermore is still going to be where it really came together for me. But still, there's a lot of fun stuff here.
Yeah, I think to me, I feel like Taylor is a pop star. She's a singer-songwriter, but she is a pop star. And I feel like for someone, and in that way, she's kind of in rarefied air, right? I think oftentimes women are one or the other. And I feel like Taylor, at least for this sort of generation, is probably the only person that straddles both lines so well, almost perfectly, which is just part of her brilliance. And so for me, like sonically, as someone who goes to see her in concert, Folklore and Evermore aren't pop star albums. Like they're great
True.
albums. I love. But for someone who's going to play Cowboy Stadium or like Soldier Field, like multiple nights in a row, you kind of have to have both. And so I appreciate the sort of, you can tell that she like recorded this as she's recording her old music because, you didn't mention it, but she released also like Target got like an exclusive edition where there were 3 additional songs on that one. And the one song, it's called Hits Different. It sounds so much like it could have been on like Red. And so you can see just like her history. And so I think it's like very fitting that the tour is going to be called Eras because I think Midnight's does a really good job of bringing all those eras together.
Yeah, and speaking of songs, music that'll play in a stadium, you've got Antihero, the first single, and that one, I mean, despite everything I said about loving the Folklore stuff, it's such a great song. I love the synths there. The chorus is, instantly going to be something not only heard in stadiums, but to use to represent her career, I think, when it is all said and done. And obviously, Antihero brings up this idea of split identity, which I think she explores throughout the album, that she's not all good, she's not all bad, but something more complicated in between. I'm curious to hear, Kathryn, what you think is meant here on this album by the term antihero. Not only in the song, but in the others that do reveal this conflicted feeling about whether she's singing about herself or whether she's more in character or kind of adopting the Taylor Swift persona. What do you think is meant here by this idea of antihero on the album?
Yeah, I will say Taylor is like super hyper aware. Like she knows everything and everyone's perceptions of her. And I think she maybe part of it is just that thing that all of us go through when we go into our 30s where we can kind of like reflect back and we just are like, oh, well, I can see how I made a bad choice here. Or like I've heard her talk in previous interviews about how people, sort of her early persona of kind of like wide-eyed innocence of how it was like all an act and that she's very manipulative or calculating. And she was like, it's because I'm a woman. Whereas like, she's like, I'm shrewd. Essentially, she was like, I'm shrewd. And like, I know what I'm doing. Basically, I'm in control of all of these things. And like that she's making a conscious choice. And I think that is what I see and hear in Antihero is like her kind of owning that like, I know I'm not perfect. I know that I have these faults, but people make me to seem worse than I am. And or that I'm like in like maybe like make me seem like I'm a bad person. And like particularly with the Kanye thing, like you've taken this too far and you are trying to make him the bad guy, or with the Scooter Braun and the music thing, like that you keep these things going, but that people are still rooting for you because they enjoy your music. And so I think Antihero is her really grappling, one, I think interior, but also two, like all of these sort of messages she's hearing of like, maybe tongue-in-cheek, I'm the problem, and that it's got to be exhausting for my fans to always be rooting for the antihero. Like, that maybe in a lot of ways, circles, her success is frustrating to people. I think a lot of people don't understand. I think part of it is because she's a woman. I think because she's like a young-ish white woman. Like, and I think Folklore, to people who really like that, it's because it's like, that's very clear. Like, we understand what you're doing. This music sonically makes sense. You're not trying to be a pop star. You are a singer-songwriter. I feel like the narrative is easier to grasp. And I think, so I think that's what Antihero is. I think that's what Mastermind is. I think it's both Taylor, the persona, and Taylor herself grappling with those identities. And the sort of thoughts that keep you awake about yourself in the middle of the night of like, did I do the wrong thing here? Am I the bad guy? Maybe I'm the problem.
You mentioned Mastermind, and I think Karma is another anti-heroic song. on here. You describe well the tension at work in a lot of those, where a couple of things are going on at once. She is confessing to some degree, but also defending herself in the other hand from accusations she feels is too strong or have gone too far. So yeah, I like how you describe it in terms of narrative, and this is a much more complicated narrative
Yeah.
you are getting on Midnights, and maybe that speaks more to her career, her gift, her actual persona than something like Folklore or Evermore does. So tell me, gave you this strange assignment. If that's kind of the picture of an anti-hero you see in the album, is there any figure in the Bible who strikes, not to say it's a Taylor Swift figure, but strikes a similar posture, maybe captures this tension you've been describing as the one that she does on some of these songs? Did anybody come to mind?
Yeah. So when you asked me that question, the person that immediately came to mind is David, in the sense that I just think for as much good as David, there are so many like things where he made the wrong choice. And yet still God called him a man after my own heart. And this sort of awareness that, yeah, that you're imperfect and a sinner and it may be quote unquote an anti-hero, but that doesn't mean that you don't have other like things to offer. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like David could be an anti-hero in a way.
And a songwriter, the psalmist.
Yeah,
so
and he
it
was a
works,
songwriter.
right?
It does work.
I like it.
And a
Yes.
musician. Yeah.
Perfectly. That's great. Can I throw one at you that came to
Yeah.
mind as I was thinking about this? David makes sense to me. I also thought maybe about Rebecca, and that's
Oh,
because
yeah.
there's some masterminding at work
Yeah.
with her deception of Isaac, so he would bless Jacob rather than Esau. And I like the idea too, though, that we see in the larger Old Testament narrative, this is ultimately to fulfill God's purpose. So there's this other sense of another active hand at work, yet she's a very conflicted figure. She's in this in-between state in that story in particular, I think, of villain and hero. And
Yeah.
so I wondered if that might be not a one-on-one
Yeah.
match, but one that kind of works.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think to me, what I love about that is there's just like, we're all complicated humans. And I think we're all sort of between the villain and the hero. And, we play both. But I think for me, like the larger thing I thought theologically is the importance of like this self-awareness, right? Of seeing ourselves rightly as sinners first, then like saved by grace. And I sort of really appreciated that about the album of like, just kind of like, I think really letting go of this like persona of like, innocent, kind of wide-eyed and like being like kind of really fully, to me, like sonically for the first time, like owning, I am a mastermind. I am an anti-hero. I do think a lot about karma. I do think about revenge sort of. So to me, it feels like more grown up in a way of like, yeah, I don't have to play this role. I don't have to pretend to be this person anymore. And, it served a purpose for a while. And so I think even for us of like, just like owning that we're sinners and imperfect. And I think helps us like, one, receive the grace of God more like gratefully and thoughtfully. But I think, yeah, also just like taking that pressure off to always be like the hero.
Mm-hmm. And the way you're describing what that looks like or sounds like on Midnights, I think is also distinct from some of what we get on Reputation, maybe,
Yeah.
where it is also a throwing away of that innocent persona, but from a different posture towards a different purpose, I think, than
Yeah.
what we see here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Reputation is more of like an angry, like a,
Mm.
I was scorned and burned and I'm mad about this. And I feel
Yeah.
like maybe Midnights is a more of like kind of reflecting back on like, I don't need that anymore. Like a more like, yeah, a more you're owning it yourself and not in a kind of how you like work through things. You're mad something. Maybe the Rebecca story is like a perfect fit of this of like, yeah, it was very deceitful at the time and like her motives were wrong. And then, but for the larger story and God's narrative and the things that he was working, that was how things were supposed to be. And it sort of feels like that to me, I think is a good maybe analogy for the difference, I think, between Reputation and Midnights.
Well, thank you very much, Kathryn. If people want more about this album, Midnights, Joylonda Jameson wrote about it at thinkchristian.net. She listened, speaking of David and the Psalms, she listened to the album alongside Psalm 139 and talked about how, we're told there, even in darkest midnights, God is there. and touches on this idea that if there's gospel hope offered to antiheroes, and as you described, we all are, right? We're all struggling with our split selves in this way. Joylanda finds it there in Psalm 139. So that's at thinkchristian.net. And again, if you find it hard to keep up with all our articles, you can always subscribe to get our emails. So go ahead and do that at thinkchristian.net/subscribe, and you will not miss out on a single one. Thank you again, Kathryn. I think next time we talk probably won't be until we do our Best Pop Culture of 2022 show. So I'll be in touch with you about the details for that. But until then, take care.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Antiheroes are always going to appeal to us, I think, because we can see ourselves in them, the way we're pulled between our selfish instincts and a higher calling. In her Think Christian post on Taylor Swift's Midnights, Jolanda Jameson reminds us both of the importance of responding to that calling and the assurance we get in Scripture that God is there to catch us when we fall short of being perfect heroes. Jolanda wrote this: "Unlike the world standard of perfection, which Taylor Swift has been unfairly held to more than most, God's standard is tempered by grace and mercy given to us through Jesus Christ. We can rest peacefully knowing that God stands ready to reaffirm his love for us and silence all anxious thoughts of doubt, even in our midnights." Thank you to Joylanda for that post. Thanks also to Kathryn Freeman and J.R. Forasteros for joining me on this episode. You could connect with both of them on Twitter. JR is at JR Forasteros, and Kathryn is at Kathryn Annette. We are on Twitter too. Of course, you can find us at Think Christian. Find us that way on Facebook as well. And there are video versions of the TC podcast, as well as some other video content up on the Think Christian YouTube channel. So just search for Think Christian on YouTube to get to that. If you are watching us on YouTube right now, well, then you missed out on a couple of tracks compiled by John J. Thompson for his Spotify playlist to accompany this episode, all under the theme of antiheroes. Search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify if you want to hear those tracks. Now, you've heard me ask from time to time for listeners to review the show on Apple Podcasts. Well, thank you to Philip Marinello, who did just that recently. We appreciate it, Philip. Every review does help us out. So if others of you could just take 30 seconds or so, leave us a star rating, maybe a couple of lines, that would be great. It does help raise our profile on the platform and then find new listeners. The TC Podcast is a listener-supported production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more information. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Basley. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks to consider how another corner of our fandom connects with our faith.